Thank you so much, Brad, and all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I actually came to Michigan on my first trip to the U.S. and came to Detroit the day after the Tigers had won the World Series. It seemed the entire town was knee-deep in the litter from the celebration. It was an extraordinary time. Then I went to Grand Rapids and Calvin, and I've never seen such a beautiful campus in the middle of September, or whenever it was by then. And so when they invited me back, I accepted with alacrity, except it was in the January term. In fact, each time I've been to Calvin and to Hope, it's been in January or February, and I said to my wife, I'm not sure I'm going to accept that one again. But it's a real pleasure to be with you. In 1843, there was a young New England scholar who was determined to do research among all the surviving veterans of the Revolutionary War. And among the many people he met, there was a Captain Levi Preston who was 70 years older than him, 91. And he shyly asked him, well, why did you go out to fight? The old boy thought the question so absurdly obvious. He said nothing. Slowly raised himself up to his full height. Well, surely you were oppressed. We weren't oppressed, he growled. Well, how about the Stamp Act? Never paid a penny of it, he said. Well, how about the tea tax? Didn't drink a drop of it. He said the boys threw it in the harbor before we got there. Well, surely you'd read Sidney and Harrington and Locke and Burke. Never heard of them, he said. All we had was a Bible, Isaac Watts's hymnal, and a farmer's almanac. And the interview was clearly going nowhere. And so the student again asked, well, why did you go out to fight? And this time, the old boy gave an immortal answer. We had always been free, and we intended to be free always. And the redcoats didn't mean that we should. Now, if you think of that, that is an incredibly daring statement. Free always? Always free. Because if you know anything about history, freedom never lasts forever. And yet that idea that in founding this republic they could create a free republic that could stay free possibly forever is probably the most daring, intellectually and politically, the most daring part of the American experiment. St. Augustine disagreed with the great Roman orator Cicero. Cicero had said a nation is an assemblage of interests. Augustine said no. A nation is defined by its loved things held in common. What is it a nation loves supremely? If that thing it loves supremely is noble, the nation may be noble. If that thing it loves supremely is in good health, the nation may be in good health. But you can assess a nation by the health and the condition of the loved thing it holds in common. Now, is there any question, certainly to those of us outside this country, and most of you inside this country, what that loved thing held in common is? Freedom. But how do we assess America today in the light of freedom? As a European, but a great admirer of this country, I've been deeply sad in the last 2 weeks. The Chinese are attacking you as hypocritical because of the stands on spying. The Russians are describing you as decadent because of so much of the sexual behavior today. Many of the Europeans in the extremes are calling America totalitarian, partly because of the surveillance and partly because of what they call the consumer land of sexual decadence. And what's extraordinary is you have some leading Americans like Pat Buchanan and several significant Europeans who've actually looked to Putin rather than to America to stand today for civilization. So I want to raise that question of freedom and ask where we are in terms of the Founding Fathers and what might be done today. It's very obvious that they were concerned with three tasks in establishing the Republic. The first and the second, relatively obvious, but the third, ignored. The first task was winning freedom. The revolution, 1776, that's not unique. The French did it, the Russians did it, the Chinese did it. Many people have thrown off an ancien regime and established freedom. But the framers went on to order freedom. The Chinese, the Russians, the French didn't. Their revolution spiraled down to demonic disorder that was worse, really, than the tyranny they replaced. But the genius of this country was the ordering of freedom, not just the revolution, but the Constitution. But the third task for the framers, hardly anyone picks up today. Sustaining freedom. You remember Ben Franklin's famous words when he was asked what they'd achieved in Philadelphia? A republic, madam, if you can keep it. And all the framers talked about the perpetuation of our institutions. The young Abraham Lincoln, only 28, asked to address the Lyceum in Springfield. And what was his topic? He chose the perpetuation of our institutions and discusses what he called the accounts running. 50 years after the revolution, how are we doing? I've lived in Washington 30 years. I've never seen anyone address that notion of sustaining or renewing freedom. But go on with the framers. They had a deep awareness of the menaces to freedom. They were revolutionary, but they were also rooted. They had ransacked the classics to understand why political systems always failed. And there were three reasons, and the first one they virtually ignored, which was the challenge of external menaces, for obvious reasons. The nearest serious enemy, 3,000 miles away, and you're a country with the world's two greatest oceans as your buffers. Of course, we can't take that casually today in the day of intercontinental ballistic missiles and box cutters. And obviously, we take that much more seriously today. But the second and third menaces, hardly anyone talks about. The second menace the framers looked at was what Polybius, the Greek historian in general, called the corruption of customs. And Polybius' thinking is interesting. He says, what's decisive is a constitution of a country. But, he said, unlike many Americans who read that and go to sleep, the Constitution rests in a bedding of customs, traditions, moral standards. And if that bedding in which the Constitution is resting, if that bedding is corrupted, the best constitution in the world will never hold things together. And the dangerous times are times of power and times of prosperity. And the framers were very aware of that. The third challenge, in one word, is the toughest of all: time. You probably know that Edward Gibbon wrote his great classic on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire the same year the Constitution was passed. In the last volume, he raises the question, why did Rome fall? And his first answer was the injuries of time. The passing of time, as we'd add, the presence of sin, nothing lasts forever. And you can see that awareness in the framers, even in the young Abraham Lincoln. He talks about the assaults of the silent artilleries of time on the walls of the Republic. But again, in my 30 years in Washington, I've never heard anyone refer to anything like that, although that's a strong theme right down at least until the end of the 19th century. Now, how did the framers hope to resist those forces and establish a free society that could last forever? Again, hardly anyone discusses it today, but the framers had what they didn't give a name to, Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, he calls it the habits of the heart. My own term for it, not theirs, is the golden triangle of freedom. Because you look at almost all the founding generation, with almost no exceptions, from very conservative like George Mason to much more liberal like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, they all agreed on what the golden triangle of freedom was. First, that freedom requires virtue. Second, that virtue requires faith of some sort. And thirdly, that faith of any sort requires freedom. Each of those legs of the triangle was crucial, and you can see in the last generation, all of them have been either neglected, dismissed, or under very serious assault. Among the elements of virtue the founders discussed was the notion of character. On the one hand, character was the bridge between followers and leaders who could trust a leader when they were in the dark if they knew his or her character. Now compare that with today when, say, President Clinton was impeached. A bunch of America's scholars wrote to the New York Times saying character didn't matter. All that matters today is competence. But actually, just the history of the presidency alone shows that character is absolutely crucial to leadership, but routinely ignored today. And you know the challenges to any mention of faith, and you know in the last 4 years, 6 years, the enormous challenges to freedom of conscience and religious freedom, which is the third part of that triangle. Each of the legs of the triangle are dismissed or assaulted today. So the question comes to those who still believe in freedom, because everyone does in terms of lip service. If we reject the framers' way of sustaining freedom, how do we hope to sustain it? And almost nobody who rejects it puts any new position into place. But we have to then face the paradox of freedom, which the framers knew well. And you can put it simply, you all know phrases like freedom is not free, but there's an even deeper paradox. The greatest enemy to freedom is freedom. And there are always a number of ways in which freedom declines. One is that freedom becomes permissiveness and becomes license and undermines itself. The second is when freedom-loving people who want to be safe put such an emphasis on security that they're no longer free. One nation under surveillance. And the third is that freedom-loving people so prize freedom that they will do anything to fight for it, even the things that contradict freedom. Think Abu Ghraib. And you've had examples of all those three things in the last decade very powerfully. There is a paradox to freedom. Freedom is its own worst enemy and almost always undercuts itself. Where do we see the crisis of freedom today? I suggest one obvious area, I virtually referred to it without spelling it out, is the alienation of many American leaders. Not all, thank God. But in many parts of this country, notions such as freedom or Americanism are either dismissed as hypocritical or even as coercive. And in many of the intellectual circles today, they would be scoffed at by many. And you have a very serious alienation of certain segments of American leadership. And the question is raised by historians. If any nation reaches the point where a significant number of its thought leaders are against the ideas and the convictions that once made it great, what is the future of that nation? And quite clearly, as postmodernism has bitten deeper into much of American culture, that situation is approaching. The third place you can see the crisis very easily, certainly from the outside, is the breakdown in the transmission of values. A free country is always in the business of transmission in two ways in every generation. There has to be a handing on from the older generation to the younger generation. We call it education, and above all, civic education. But it's no secret that since the 1960s, civic education has virtually disappeared in America. One historian puts it's relatively easy to become an American still, but increasingly difficult to know what it is to be American because of the crisis of civic education in many of our public schools. The other area of essential transmission is from the old-timers in the country to the newcomers, immigration. But again, that whole notion of civic education so that people are integrated in society and they know what it is to be an American and live like an American has increasingly been lost. And there's a profound crisis of transmission And another historian says, soon immigration will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution unless civic education is restored. The third area, to use Polybius' term, is a corruption of customs. And you can see how many of the fundamental truths in America are not what they used to be. All sorts of reasons for it, but maybe there's nothing more crucial than freedom itself. If you look at the framers' understanding of freedom, it was very close to the biblical understanding. That freedom is a gift of God, that freedom requires a framework of truth, and there's no such thing as bare freedom. As Lord Acton says, freedom is not the permission to do what you like, but the power to do what you ought. But we need to know what's responsibility, what truth is, so there's a framework for freedom. And you can see that the dominant American view of freedom today is libertarian. Put philosophically, there are always two parts to freedom, the negative side and the positive side. Freedom from, free from colonial oppression, free from bullying, free from addiction. Those are important. Freedom from, no one's free unless they're free from anything that's confining or constricting them. But that's only half of freedom. The other half is freedom for, freedom to be. And to be free for and free to be, you have to know the truth of who you are and what you're called to be. And today, you can see almost all American freedom, both conservative and also liberal, is a libertarianism. The liberals saying, get the government off our bodies, and many of the conservatives get the government off our backs in terms of economics. But you have the flourishing of a libertarian freedom, which is a pale shadow of the framers' freedom, and more importantly, a pale shadow of Christian and Jewish freedom, and is quite literally unsustainable. What has to happen? Put simply, we haven't much time to expand on anything, we need to see a restoration of civic education, so that all young Americans growing up and every new immigrant who becomes an American knows what are the founding principles of the unum of the American Republic that balances the plurum, the pluribus. Today there's an incredible sense of the pluribus, the diversity, the many, but hardly any sense of those uniting first principles which should bring all Americans together. The restoration of civic education. The second obvious area that needs opening up is the freedom of a civil public square. The genius of this country was once that everyone, based on their freedom of conscience, was free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. But with the culture warring for the last 50 years, with the notion of strict separation creeping in law, much closer to the French Revolution than to the American, and now with the aggressive and strident secularism in many places, you can see that much of the public square is freezing over, and any mention of religious symbols or religious language or religious content in many areas now is highly contested and deeply controversial and threatening to be squeezed out. That will undermine the Republic. The third thing, though, and we have to say sadly, is we need a renewal of faith. The simple fact is that groups who may be 2% of America have far more cultural influence than Jews and Christians who may together be 85, 86% of America. And the obvious reason for that is that Christians are not living Christianly. As Pastor Ellis said so eloquently, we are not today the salt and the light. And tiny and highly destructive groups, who are very small in number, have an extraordinary influence. And it would not be so if those who are a heavy majority were really living as our Lord called us to live. Surely we need to admit that a huge part of the problem in this country is us. And we need a renewal that we may live up to the high calling of our Lord. Does that mean it's all over? Not at all. I love the fact that one of the things the framers talked about, and I'll finish with this thought, they saw there were three parallels between themselves in the 1770s and the Puritans who'd preceded them, and the Jews who'd preceded them. And it's the third parallel that I'm interested in. First, though, there was a parallel between what the Jews called Exodus and the Puritans called conversion, and the framers, with their understanding of what they were doing, creating a nation, called revolution. In other words, each of those three was a liberating, formative experience which shaped a new people. The second parallel was that what the Jews called covenant, the Puritans also called covenant. And the framers called, and you probably know well, Constitution. Because the Constitution, historically, is a secular, nationalized form of covenant. But it's the third parallel I'm interested in at the moment. What the Jews call, and this is a word used in the Old Testament that's deep and rich with meaning, and many Christians have never unpacked it. What the Jews called return. When the nation of Israel left God and turned to false gods, idols who are nothings, and then turned back from the false gods to God in repentance and humility, God turned back to them. And the whole thing was called return. What the Jews call return, the Puritans call revival. And the framers had their own secular national version of that. You have a conservative like George Mason who speaks of the need for a frequent recurrence to fundamental first principles. Thomas Jefferson, much more liberal and deist, he talks of the need for a revolution in every generation, because every generation, as Tocqueville said, is a new people. There can be a return. It would take leadership. It would take vision. It would take the absence of culture warring and something that's articulated in the interests of all Americans and not a fresh round of culture warring. But a return is possible. And we as people of hope, as followers of Jesus, should be in the forefront of pointing the way forward. Tocqueville, who is always recognized as the greatest non-American commentator on America, he wrote Democracy in America, as you know, and you Americans love it because he commended your democracy. But you know, he wrote it for his fellow Frenchmen, not for Americans. And all his life, he was comparing the American Revolution with the French Revolution. And he was a deeply disappointed lover in the French Revolution. For one thing, it had put equality above liberty, which the current administration and many liberals today are doing the same mistake in doing once again. And there are always disastrous results when you put equality above liberty. Certainly you must always balance liberty with equality, but equality without liberty always leads to envy, to leveling, and to an increase in the state power. But Tocqueville kept comparing the two all his life, and towards the end, he made this wonderful little remark with which I'll close. He said, in a revolution, as in a novel, the hard part to invent is the ending. Your framers had their blind spots, some of them profoundly evil, like those who clung to slavery. But by and large, they wrote a brilliant first chapter. And there have been many brilliant chapters written since then. But if you look at the gathering crisis, not only of freedom, which I've looked at this morning, but in many, many other areas in America today, America is very, very close to the threshold or the tipping point, or whatever word you like to use. The chapter that the next generation writes will be critical for the future of America. And I trust that the people of God will be in there with their understanding of the Lord's sovereignty and of the importance of truth and of the profundity of human dignity and how you create freedom and sustain freedom and many, many other things. So that next chapter is a good chapter and not one of the chapters that will be towards the end of this great country. God be with you here in Michigan. Thank you.